It is the 24th of July 2013, and the high-speed train of the Spanish railway company Renfe is approaching the station of Santiago de Compostela, capital of the Galicia region. The train driver is on the phone to the train manager. At first it was a normal day in which we go on the train. We also decided to go by train instead of by car, because going on a little trip we understood that it was safer, because I knew the security systems that high speed supposedly has, and I have always been by car to Galicia. As I was going with my little nieces, I decided to take the train. And unfortunately, as we were going into Santiago, I had already got up. Well, the train lurched and finally derailed, and there was a big impact.
It is incomprehensible that a train that reaches 200 kilometers an hour, that a train that has cost all of us Spaniards an awful lot and many millions, has a braking system that depends on the driver seeing a villa with a pool. That is unimaginable.
The high-speed train came off the rails at 180 kilometers per hour, and carriages crashed into each other, killing 79 people and leaving 143 severely injured. Pressure from the Victims' Association led to a parliamentary inquiry that highlighted a scandalous number of deficiencies and errors at the highest level of the Spanish government, as it hastily extended the high-speed rail line to the furthest corner of Spain.
Será ese día, el sábado 10 de diciembre, cuando hagamos el viaje inaugural entre las tres capitales a bordo de un tren AVE de Renfe.
Chamartín Station, Madrid, July 2013. More than 200 passengers are boarding a high-speed train from Madrid to Santiago de Compostela. What they do not know is that a number of decisions at the highest level of the Transport Ministry have made the line unsafe for the trains that travel along it. Aboard is Curro Garcia. Cristina Lira and Javier Garcia are his parents.
And in the afternoon I sent him a WhatsApp asking him how he was doing, and he told me that it was great because it was much more comfortable than going by plane. He never used to take the train. He always went by car or travelled by plane, and that he was very comfortable because he was big, and then, well, he had space for his legs, and that he was reading his e-book, and that was at 8.
My son David passed away in the accident along with his girlfriend. They went by train because they worked as cabin crew. A child is a person's life project. You can change your job, you can change other things, but the son comes first. He should always come first. We can say that at 27 he was killed for lack of safety on a high-speed line. That is why we're here, to vindicate him.
Yes, well, I remember that at that moment I was opening the door of the car to go into the corridor, to get out of the train, because we were already arriving in Santiago. And at that moment I felt the train moving. But obviously, when that blow happened, everything became cloudy and everything turned black. And I think that the brain does with an impact like that. What it does is totally disconnect.
No sé lo que es una guerra, ¿vale?
I don't know what a war is, but it cannot be very different from this. You see the square destroyed by a car that could be a missile. Do you hear crying? Pain of the dead that came out in front of the windows of the car. You see bloody people. You see helplessness because you can't save everyone. Although you know that it is impossible, that there were people who died.
This was not an accident. This was a tragedy. An accident is inevitable, and this was totally avoidable. This is why we prefer not to use the term accident, but tragedy, which is what happened, because 80 dead, 150 injured, is a great tragedy.
Martín Rosas is a resident of Angrois, a suburb of Santiago de Compostela, and was one of the first on the scene.
We saw the car right in the center and we stopped. There were already neighbors there until we heard the first scream. And that's when we got into that car and started pulling people out. We were left unaware of a lot because of our eagerness to help. We could have hurt people more because we don't know how to lift people or how to act in that case. So we got out, and there was a moment when, of course, we saw the wagon and wondered where the rest of the train was. And when we went to look at the track, we saw everything. The big part, the wagons one on top of the other, and we started to go down and brake with our hands and climb in to save the people, as many people as possible.
And when I opened my eyes, I saw myself on the tracks with the train on top of me. And at that moment, well, I saw a fire nearby. And above all, I was afraid that the train would fall on top of me, because I began to see that people were moving, that people were coming to rescue or something. So my effort was to get out, and finally, dragging myself as best I could, because my leg and hip and arm were very bad and I couldn't breathe well. In the end, I think it was the train security guard who was the one that helped me out and put me there on the tracks.
En el kilómetro 80 fue donde tomé la curva a 200, bueno, a 200 no, a 190, una cosa así. Claro, venían verde.
Y tenía que tomar los 80, ¿no?
Sí, y tenía que pasar 80.
Vale.
Ay, Dios mío, pobres viajeros, me cago en mi conciencia.
The Spanish railway company Renfe's Type 730 high-speed train came off the rails at 8:41 p.m. on the 24th of July 2013, after entering the dangerous Angrois bend known as the Agrandiera Curve, smashing into the concrete wall and a road bridge. The train was travelling at 180 kilometers an hour and the driver was on the phone. In his first call to bosses, he admitted to having entered the curve too fast. But some of what he said has been censored. He was arrested and accused of 79 counts of manslaughter. Over time, and thanks to the work of the Victims Association and lawyers, the whole truth of what went wrong that day was dragged out. Manuel Prieto is the train driver's defense attorney.
Why did the accident happen? The accident happened, it has been said, because the driver did not brake or braked late coming from a straight line at 200 kilometers per hour. Obviously, speed is imposed. It is not decided by a train driver, the speed that the train has to go.
Well, the driver after the accident, I blamed him entirely because they told us he was going at 190 and it was the information that came out in all the media.
Mientras el juez estaba haciendo el levantamiento de cadáveres.
While the judge was overseeing the removal of corpses, they approached him to say that that it was the driver, and the judge had to say that this was not the time to lay blame, and that he had enough to do picking up the number of corpses that were there.
la cantidad de cadáveres que había.
This approach was adopted from the earliest moments and continued constantly, because the main issue was the protection of the image of Spain and high-speed trains of Spain.
The high-speed train line between Madrid and Galicia was opened just 17 months before the accident and was considered a milestone in the modernization of the Spanish railway system, a major achievement for the government and for the Spanish railway industry overall.
Será ese día, el sábado 10 de diciembre, cuando hagamos el viaje inaugural entre las tres capitales a bordo de un tren AVE de Renfe.
El ministro de Fomento, José Blanco, y el presidente de la Xunta de Galicia, Alberto Núñez Feijóo, presidirán mañana sábado el acto inaugural de la nueva línea de alta velocidad Ourense-Santiago de Compostela a Coruña, que entrará en servicio el domingo.
It opened with great fanfare, and on the news it was said that high speed had reached Galicia and the line from Orense to Santiago had been opened. It was what the government did at the time, and anyone can see the newspapers. Both the president of the Adif network and that of Renfe, as well as the one who was the General Secretary of Development, who is the second of the ministry, they went out to the media to say that it was not a high-speed accident, because above all, what we later discovered today is that there were a series of contracts and possible businesses, both in Brazil and in Poland, that if you have had an accident in high speed, you cannot compete.
The Secretary of State of Infrastructure went so far as to say that this was not a high-speed accident. And above all, since they'd already recorded the audio of the driver, they said that it was a mistake by the driver, that he should have been driving at I don't know what speed, but he was going much faster. And from that moment on, they were already manipulating the issue because they cut the audio, and a phrase that the driver says in it, which is, I had already warned them. That phrase was cut.
¿Qué iba a pasar?
La cortaron. Claro, venían verde.
Y tenía que tomar los 80, ¿no?
Sí, y tenía que pasar 80.
Vale.
Ay, Dios mío. Pero eso ya se lo tenía dicho al de seguridad, que eso era muy peligroso. Somos humanos y se nos puede pasar. Es que eso es inhumano, esta curva.
So the objective of the government was very clear, and I think that of the government and the opposition. And it was that the Spanish high-speed train had not had an accident. I think that was the greatest concern that they had, that the state had. And I believe that everything that has happened since then comes from there. The obstruction of justice, that 9 years have passed, that there is no independent technical investigation as requested by the European Union. I believe that everything is a consequence of the fact that the high-speed rail system was the jewel in the crown of Spain.
Después del accidente, pues conseguimos en unos meses.
After the accident, well, it took us a few months to gather some victims and make a platform in defense of the victims, because we saw that we needed help from some professionals. So we created the association, and from there, well, our fight began, because the victims from the first moment should not be deceived.
Y a partir de ahí, pues empezó nuestra lucha porque a las víctimas desde el primer momento nos ningunearon y nos engañaron.
Although at the time I knew nothing, it seemed very bad to me that on a high-speed train they said that it had been due to human error, right? That's the first thing I thought until I recovered and was operational. I think it was in November. And I remember that one of the first things I did was to go to the website of Adif, which is the Ministry of Infrastructure, to see how security systems were installed on the line. And my surprise was that what I saw is that supposedly the system that was installed both on the train and on the track was the ERTMS security system that continuously controls the speed. And it was the first surprise that I got. And seeing that even what was put on the website of the Infrastructure Ministry itself turned out later to be a lie. It was not installed as far as Santiago, nor installed correctly, and they had also disinstalled it.
If the high-speed train had been equipped with the ERTMS system, this accident would not have happened, which is what the technicians have already confirmed. That is, if the ERTMS system had been operational, this accident simply would not have occurred.
The train carries 2 console telephones and a cell phone that the company gives to the driver. The call can come in through any of the 3. That is, they are the same. A train driver has to answer corporate calls. That is, the mobile phone he answers is the phone given to him by the company. There is a document called a train document that is compiled where a series of data appears. And there are 2 pieces of data, right? So who is the driver, what is his name, and what is his cell phone? Who is the supervisor, and what is his mobile phone? And they give it to both of them so they can communicate. He had to answer.
But what was done was to show that the driver was like a madman who was going 200 per hour. That is not so. But he was going 200 kilometers per hour because that is indicated in the time book. And on a straight line of 80 kilometers with a tunnel per minute, he has the call of the inspector and has to pick up the phone. It is a corporate phone. It is not prohibited. He loses spatial references as to where he is and loses reference to the tunnel, a signal that he had, a way of knowing when he had to start braking.
This is the line where the accident occurred. This is the curve. This is the crash site. And this is the situation of the line on the 24th of July 2013, which is when the accident occurred. And we are going to compare it with the current situation that started on the 29th of June 2014. That is approximately almost a year later, 11 months. What was not there and what is there? These 2 beacons that are here, the only ones, were 2 ERTMS beacons that, as the train does not have ERTMS connected, did absolutely nothing. This was a signal known as First 7. It is an advanced signal that was clear, and here we have others that were also clear. But in all this section, we see that there is no data. This is a signal which is right at the accident site, where it indicates a speed limit of 80. But of course, if you are not already at 80 here, there is no length left, so there is no way, it is not possible.
José Fernández is the expert engaged by the Victims Association to explain what happened and identify the institutional responsibilities.
In Spain, the legislation and the works that have been carried out require that the high-speed lines be equipped with the same European regulations, and therefore, in addition to routes with wide curves that allow circulation at up to 300 or 350 kilometers per hour, and be equipped with ATP systems, or automatic train protection, that controls the speed of the trains at each point of their route.
Controlan la velocidad de los trenes en cada punto de su recorrido.
Al tratarse de una línea de alta velocidad, que es como lo explicaron y lo vendieron a la opinión pública.
But since it's a high-speed line, as they explained and sold it to the public, the security standard that should have been installed is the ERTMS system all the way to Santiago de Compostela. It was true that the ERTMS was causing problems between the onboard system, which is the system mounted on the train, inside the vehicle, and the ground system, which are the beacons installed along the track. It gave a series of problems that made the trains have to stop. They lost a few minutes, just a few minutes. They were not long delays, so they made the decision to disconnect the ERTMS system throughout the route, and it remained under the protection of ASFA.
But the fundamental difference between the ERTMS and the ASFA is that the ERTMS controls the speed of the train at all times of circulation. The ASFA only controls it at those points where it has previously been decided to install control beacons.
Como el ASFA no tuvo en consideración cuando lo instalaron.
When they installed ASFA, they did not take into consideration putting a beacon to protect the curve, which had a speed limit of 80 kilometers per hour. the Angrandeira curve at Angrois just before Santiago de Compostela. That beacon would have prevented the train from going through that point at more than 60 kilometers per hour, not more than 80, or would have displayed a warning that the limit of 80 had been reached. But the beacons are programmed to register 60 when they're activated.
Las balizas son unos aparatos que se colocan en la vía.
The beacons are devices that are placed on the track between the two rails and that emit an electromagnetic signal that is, when the train passes, that it has a sensor, since it emits a signal that the train captures. If the train receives a stop signal at a certain distance, then the driver logically has to start braking, that is, to pass the next signal at a certain speed. There are other beacons that control that a certain speed is not exceeded, and if the train passes over them at a higher speed, they inform the driver, and if he does not react within a time of several seconds, the train mechanism itself produces an emergency braking.
El propio mecanismo del tren le produce un frenado de emergencia, ¿no?
If the beacon had been installed as it is today, as it was 5 or 6 days after the accident would never have happened either, right?
No, if there wasn't the ERTMS security system, there was the ASFA system. First they say that it is a security system, and it is not a security system. It is a support system that requires a series of beacons and programming, which then, days later, was done, and the trains could no longer pass more than 80. But you have to program it. If you do not install the beacon, it is not programmed. You have the ASFA system, but it's absolutely useless.
There is a host of bungling that has only one explanation: the rush to inaugurate, the rush to inaugurate, the rush to inaugurate.
We depended on the train drivers, as they have said in court, recognizing when it was 4 kilometers before they had to start braking. Some train drivers noticed a villa with a swimming pool. Others took other types of references. There wasn't even a speed limit sign. There was absolutely nothing anymore.
Then it is clear that this is not, at any time, something that the train driver can use or should use to do his job.
That day, he receives a corporate phone call from the train controller, the supervisor who is on the train. During that conversation, he went by something that he had as a reference he remembered, that told him the curve was coming, because he had no other signal that indicated it.
And what happens is that he brakes late, because when he sees the curve, that at 400 meters, it's not like a car or a truck. A train, you don't stop it at 400 meters. He goes to 200, sees the curve, pulls the brake, and enters at 170 kilometers per hour and derails at 159. It must be remembered that there was a written notice from a chief train driver, a warning that had reached several senior Renfe officials, warning of the danger and warning of what, unfortunately, happened at the curve.
Let us imagine that we are on an 88-kilometer long railway line, that 30 bridges are crossed in about 36.37 minutes, and it goes through 32 tunnels. That is, the train is permanently entering the viaduct tunnel. He evidently entered a tunnel and believed he was in the previous tunnel until he came out. He saw the curve in the distance, and that's when the distance should have been about 500 meters left, which is when he pulled the emergency brake. But the train weighs more than 400 tons, carries more than 200 passengers, and needs much more than that.
El Ministerio, por lo que supimos después, suprimió ese tramo de instalación del RTMS.
The ministry, from what we learned later, removed that section of installation of the ERTMS between approximately kilometer 80 and kilometer 88 of the newly built line. So a system that in principle is 100% safe along the entire line, since it was reduced to only 80 kilometers. Practically 7.5 kilometers were left without the protection of the ERTMS system. This will later be seen to have had consequences in some cases when incidents and even an accident occurred.
a la hora de producirse incidentes e incluso un accidente.
That line was inaugurated in December, the 11th or 10th of 2011. On December the 26th, that is 2 weeks later, a chief engineer was commissioned to carry out an inspection. There was a technical problem in the transition between the ERTMS and ASFA, so he had not yet made any trips with travellers by train. It was nothing more than test runs of the construction so far. So, to see what was happening, he got on the train, did the data, and wrote the report on it, what had to be done, what was the problem when he braked and such. And he already took advantage and wrote, saying, I have observed this situation with a curve here. Either we put a sign on along the way, or an accident is going to happen as soon as a train driver gets lost. This only 12 days before the inauguration.
A number of factors have come to light. The way the line was built, keeping the existing track into Santiago with the dangerous Agrandiera curve, the decision to remove the ERTMS safety system that caused unwanted delays, and the absence of beacons or speed sensors interfacing with the ASFA backup system deprived the train driver of any automatic warning that the train was approaching the fatal concrete wall. Distracted by a telephone call, he lost perception of where the train was. The railway company had already been warned just a few weeks after the line was opened.
So it was a so-called high-speed train tragedy, but without any security. A bomb, actually, and also because of the configuration of the train with 2 diesel wagons, one in front and one behind, which completely crushed.
They were subject to an accordion effect, and that's the reason why in the images you can see a train car at the height of a second floor. The Alvia train involved in the accident in Angrois near Santiago de Compostela is a train that was originally from the 130 series, which was only designed to provide services on electrified lines.
En España, hoy todavía, hay muchas líneas.
In Spain, there are still many lines that are operated without electrical traction. This was the case of the line from Madrid to Galicia, which had an electrified part up to the Olmedo station, and a part of almost 300 kilometers without electrification. In other words, you had to put a diesel locomotive on it, right?
Then it became a hybrid train that could run on international gauge tracks and on Iberian gauge tracks, and could run on lines where there was electrification and on lines where there was no electrification. They had to adapt the first car at each end of the train, adapt it to install what we know as a service car, where diesel tanks and the diesel engines were installed to generate the energy that moves the train.
It really is a locomotive with 2 modules, the tractor, electric motor, and the diesel engine.
This vehicle, when undergoing transformation, evidently modified its characteristics both in tonnage and in the need for power, braking, and so forth.
In other words, there is a locomotive that pulls and another that pushes, which is no longer a 75, it is 115 tons. If there is a frontal collision, this type of train is more damaging than a normal train. And the reason is, as we saw in the Angrois accident, is that the locomotive ahead, after derailing, collides with a wall. That's like hard braking. And then the 115 tons that come in the final part of the train push by inertia and are the ones that compress the set of cars. And the buckling effect causes the train to break at 2 or 3 points and a car to be thrown up on an embankment.
The investigation into what went wrong that evening has taken almost 10 years to come to its conclusion. The Spanish train company Renfe and the rail infrastructure owners Adif were accused of interfering with the investigation to protect their own interests.
The first investigating judge, and the first because we have had 2 investigating judges throughout the entire procedure, placed the entire ADIF board of directors and some technicians and some 18 more people under investigation.
Pero él, por lo visto, había pedido un traslado ya hacía tiempo.
He had apparently asked for a transfer long before, and they got him out of the way. And then they put in another judge. And this one, at the end of the investigation, only accused the driver.
Como imputado al maquinista.
We both asked for a meeting with the prosecutor because we began to discover, to meet with engineers, and we saw things that were not being investigated, such as the homologation of the train or the ERTMS system. We had a meeting with the prosecutor and we told him, can you investigate this, or even investigate that there has been misleading advertising? So the only thing we received from the prosecutor, and then he also said it publicly, is that he would ask for 40% more money.
It was disgusting.
He thought that we were shamelessly going after the money. He was so wrong, my God. The only thing we seek is truth, justice. And there came a time when I told him, well, tell me the value of my son's life. That was the first encounter we had with justice, with the prosecutor.
The Victims Association and survivors became more vocal as the suspicion of an attempted cover-up grew. On the first anniversary of the tragedy, the local Galician government attempted to blandish the survivors, victims and rescuers with a commemorative medal. The protest spread to the locals.
Unha edición especial e distinta en lembranza do que pasou hai hoxe un ano, o accidente do tren Albia en Angrois.
The first year on the first anniversary in Galicia, which is the day of St. James the Apostle. On the 25th, some medals are awarded in Galicia. And on the 24th, which is the previous day, the victims and relatives, we were going to make a demonstration. What the government did was just change the day of delivery of medals.
Why? Because we were there, we had something to protest about.
Dice 2 minutos y ahora no va a entrar nadie. Nos vamos a tener que esperar a que terminen de dar la medalla para que se rían de nosotros. Que nosotros somos las víctimas.
Hemos traído incluso la documentación todos y cada uno de los que hemos estado en el hospital y de los certificados de defunción.
We victims said that we did not want medals, that what we wanted was for there to be a truly independent investigation commission. And in the end, they had their party, they made their fanfare, and the victims were received by the riot police, and they did not let us make any demonstration.
Dispoño concederlle a Medalla de Oro de Galicia ás víctimas do accidente ferroviario de Angrois, aos veciños de Angrois.
In Spain, there is a law that in Galicia, for example, allows the Junta de Galicia, which is the government of Galicia, which was in the hands of the Partido Popular, which was also the government of Spain, and they passed a law that allows them to choose the experts.
Se solicitó por el primer juez 3 peritos.
The first investigating judge appoints 3 experts. 3 experts, an engineer, and an industrialist in the area of telecommunications with their respective teams. And immediately the Galicia government said they had the right to appoint the experts.
And of course, obviously, if it is the government, the state, that chooses the experts, then the truth is that investigative independence leaves much to be desired. They had the bad luck that there was no telecommunications engineer, one of the required experts in the government of Galicia, and it had to go out to tender. And, curiously, the only expert who comes out by judicial tender agrees with the thesis of the European Railway Agency, that a risk analysis had not been carried out and that things were poorly done.
The report of the other 2 experts appointed by the Galician government is crazy. In one of the reports, 50 or 60% of the information is copied and pasted.
What we have been discovering through the acts of the judges is that Renfe and Adif, which are the companies that managed the train and the infrastructure, even took up to 4 years to deliver papers.
For 4 years, a public body and the judges were waiting there.
And if it hadn't been for our struggle and for the engineers who have contacted us and the papers that we have delivered, they would have been kept in the dark on many things, because both Renfe and ADIF and the Minister of Public Works, they tried to hide the facts.
They have always tried to find a scapegoat, which in this case was the train driver. And from the Railway Union we have always insisted that the investigation has to be much broader, not only into legal responsibilities, but also political responsibilities. Because behind the accident there are decisions that were made prior to the day the accident happened, that led to the accident.
So we had a meeting with the minister and we asked for an investigation, a parliamentary investigation commission and a technical investigation commission. And she told us that the parliamentary one was not going to happen and that there would be an independent technical investigation. And we questioned from the beginning if this investigation was really going to be independent. And she already told us that it was. And then sadly we found out that it really wasn't independent. And we didn't say it, but rather the European Union said it through the European Railway Agency.
As the agency has already made very clear that the composition of the investigation team did not ensure the independence of the investigation, and that it did not answer the essential questions on the root causes, the committee today would like to turn to the Commission and say that this independent investigation must promptly be conducted.
The European Parliament's report strengthened the Victims' Association's demand for political accountability for the accident. Finally, thanks to everyone, to our pressure that we exerted throughout Spain, that we managed to get more than 100 city councils to sign a motion requesting a parliamentary investigation commission, in 2017 we managed to have a parliamentary investigation commission opened to examine the political responsibilities. And what we found in that parliamentary inquiry was several things. The first is that, for example, when they wanted to hear, for example, the audio of the train driver in which he says, "I was traveling at 190 when I should have been going at 80, and I already told the security that this was very dangerous because that audio had leaked to the media and been cut off at first, only with the bit about traveling at 180 without the bit that he'd mentioned already that it was very dangerous. That had been cut in the Chamber of Deputies. Both the deputies of the Popular Party and those of the Socialist Party refused to allow that audio to be heard by the people who were in the Parliamentary Investigation Commission. It was forbidden.
Usted ha pedido algo, de hecho es lo único que ha pedido, que es que se escuche el audio, y alguien, seguramente los mismos que se vanaglorian aquí cada día de decir que no vetan nada, ha decidido que eso no se escuche. Es la grabación de su conversación con el interventor. Yo voy a gastar el minuto y medio que dura esa grabación en mi tiempo para que se escuche.
Gracias. Señor, por favor, señor Rufián, si quiere, queda suspendida la sesión en este mismo.
En la Comisión de Investigación Parlamentaria se mintió mucho.
There were a lot of lies in the Parliamentary Commission. I know. I was so disappointed. I participated in the commission as a victim, but then we followed it completely, and all the technicians from Renfe, except for a few people, let's say, only 2 specific people were brave. The others came and seemed as if they had learned the lesson.
Los demás hablaban como que tenían aprendida la lección.
And then, furthermore, to make matters worse, we learned that ADIF, the infrastructure administrator that belongs to the Ministry of Public Works, had paid a consultant about 15,000 euros to advise those appearing who went to the Parliamentary Investigation Commission. So what we saw is that When these technicians were asked, well, they didn't know, they didn't answer, it wasn't so. So ridiculous. And if it weren't for the fact that there were 80 dead and 140 wounded, it seemed like a joke when an ADIF expert was asked, for example, what would have happened if the ERMTS system had been active and in service. They said they didn't know, they didn't answer.
There were no final findings by this commission because there were elections. Parliament was closed and there were no conclusions.
A partir del accidente, pues yo le echaba toda la culpa.
Well, the driver, after the accident, I blamed him entirely because they told us he was going at 190. And it was the information that came out in all the media, and the driver was in our sights. But we couldn't even see him. Over time, we realized that the man was doing his job.
Que el hombre iba haciendo todo su trabajo.
I think that the driver made a mistake. That is undeniable. What happens is that I think he is the last link in a chain of negligence and bungling. And I sincerely believe that what happened to the train driver could happen to any of us.
If the safety director of ADIF had not disconnected the system, even if the driver were distracted, the accident would never have happened. So who is guilty, the train driver or the safety director of ADIF?
It is true that the train driver and the victims have many things in common. Because we know what happened and we want to know the truth. If the whole truth were to come out, the train driver would be spared the minimum sentence because he was not given the means to do his work.
On a political level, when the trial is over, we want the Parliamentary Investigation Commission to be reopened, to refine policies, and at the judicial level, this coming October, in October 2022, the trial will be held with the train driver and with the Director of Security, ADIF Andrés Corta, as defendants.
We
want is that there be an independent technical investigation, that it arrives before the end of the trial. That is what we want most, so that as many people, or at least those who are going to make the decision about it, know why it really happened. Not what they have always said, but what really happened. But hope? Well, we don't have a lot.
I think there will be no justice, for several reasons. The first is because slow justice is not justice. By the time the trial is over, 10 years will have passed. We think that there is a lack of people on the bench, and we also have all the powers of the state against. As I was saying, we had the second prosecutor against the first prosecutor without investigating anything at all. The state attorney also defends the interests of ADIF, and it's going to be very, very difficult for everything to come to light. The chain of errors that led to the catastrophe goes back many years, and although the authorities had been warned that removing speed sensors in the 8 kilometers before the Grandeira curve could cause a fatal accident, these warnings were ignored, leaving train drivers with only visual references in the countryside to establish when they were approaching the dangerous bend. After the accident, the government cover-up became a national scandal. Justice is still far away. For the survivors and the families of the victims, the road to healing is infinitely long.
Mi sobrina tuvo, porque salió despedida y tuvo muchas operaciones y muchas roturas de...
My niece had many operations. a broken hip and leg, and many other injuries. My wife also broke 3 vertebrae and hit her leg, and I also had several fractures and several operations. We were in the ICU and in the hospital, but, well, fortunately we survived. And, well, we were very lucky because the 4 of us were finally able to get off the train.
Well, this precious person is our Curro, 27-year-old veterinarian son, a cheerful and happy person with his whole life ahead of him, with many projects, with a job that excited him.
He was a veterinarian. He worked in a hospital, and in addition to working as a veterinarian, he also taught veterinary assistants. Quite frankly, he was the model of a son.
Already with the first anniversary of the train accident, the Galician government was setting the narrative, hoping to win over the victims and blame one man, leaving those higher up out of the limelight.
Houbo un heroísmo espontáneo, que non precisa esperar por recoñecementos ou gratificacións, pero tamén algo que vai en nós dende a noite máis afastada dos nosos tempos.
I think he gave a somewhat childish speech, in the sense that there are some poor victims that society owes something to. There are some victims, there are injured people, people who have relatives who are heroes, who are the residents of Angrois, and there is a very bad guy who is the driver. I think that story was very simple, and it was the story that was launched.
In the end, we realized that this was only to clean up his image, that we are good, that we are doing the right thing, that we are understanding. And as the days passed, we found ourselves realizing that the victims continue to have the same problems. They were not being treated with respect. The relationship we have with the families of the victims and with the injured is a very strong symbiosis.
We admire their courage immensely, risking their lives, because there was a fire due to the diesel from a train. There was a fire.
They broke doors and took seats to act as rams.
And then every year on the anniversary we go there, a group of victims. They welcome us very warmly.
With love.
We help them without knowing anything. We help them get ahead in that moment, in that tragic moment. And it's hard the day we hold the meetings here to talk in front of them because you don't know what to tell them. I do not know how to appease. It is impossible to appease the pain.
Y de Santiago de Compostela siempre están y siempre estarán con nosotros. Las víctimas, sus familias, siempre tendrán nuestro apoyo, nuestro cariño, porque aquella inmensa tragedia que conmovió nuestros corazones sigue y seguirá siempre en nuestros recuerdos, especialmente hoy.
Sigue viviendo con nosotros, Le tenemos presente cada día.
And it is also our struggle that such a pleasant, charming person can't be forgotten. And so he stays here with us. We constantly talk to each other about him. With his brother, we talk almost in the present about Curro.
Entre nosotros, con su hermano, se habla casi en presente de Curro.
Dentro de los 10 años que llevamos de lucha,
In the 10 years that we have been fighting, many television networks, many journalists have come with questions that bring tears to our eyes. So I refuse. I refuse to be seen in those circumstances. Those are circumstances for me, for my family. I don't want to. No, I don't want. I don't want them to. I want them to see me fight. I fight to know the truth. I don't want them to feel sorry for me. I keep the pain in my house.
Lucho por saber la verdad, no que sientan pena de mí. Yo la pena la tengo en mi casa.
There was no reason for disactivating the balizers along the fateful last 7 kilometers of track before the bend in the rails, except that it made the train slower. A change in the train schedule would have solved that problem. The danger had been identified just a few weeks after the line had been opened, and nothing was done. The Santiago train derailment trial has brought to light once again how ultimately it is the innocent ticket-holding user and the lowest level of worker who pay for the political pressure, money savings, and shoddy planning by the self-referential higher echelons of the organization. As the sun sets on another day in Santiago, famed as a place of pilgrimage, the ultimate question has to be asked. How many more disasters have to strike before a true safety culture permeates society?